Christians have long claimed the Bible to be true. However, it hasn't always been clear how to reconcile some of its contradictions. In Genesis 1, we get the traditional 7-day creation story. Day 1, God creates the light and darkness. Day 2, God creates the heavens and the earth. And day 3, God creates the dry land, the seas, and the plant life. And so on and so forth until day 6, God creates humankind. And day 7, God rests. In Genesis 2, however, things are a little bit different. This is where we get the classic Adam and Eve story. Instead of creating humanity last here, in Genesis 2, God creates Adam from the ground, before creating any of the plant life. We see numerous contradictions in the New Testament as well. A great example of this is in the case of Jesus' death. In the Gospel of Matthew, Judas, feeling guilty for betraying Jesus, throws the money that he received into the temple. The chief priest then used this money to buy a field, and Judas goes and hangs himself. In the book of Acts, however, things are a little bit different. With the payment he received for his wickedness, Judas bought a field, there fell headlong, his body burst open, and all his intestines spilled out. So how is it that so many people have come to believe the Bible to be true when it's full of so many contradictions? Well, in this video, I'm going to talk about why it's not, or at least not in the way you might think. First, let's talk about what we mean when we say something is true. Usually what we mean when we say something is true is that that thing is real or has existence, and that if we wanted to, if we had the right equipment or method, that we could observe that thing for ourselves. For example, let's say I can't find my dog, and I ask my wife and she tells me that our dog is under our bed. How would I know if what she said was true? Well, it's obvious. I could go and check for myself. If my dog is under the bed, then what my wife said is true, and if he's not, then what she said is false. Simple. Now let's apply this idea of truth to books. Let's take a car manual, for example. A car manual is true if it accurately describes the car that I'm working on. If I follow the manual steps, say for something like changing my oil, then I should be able to successfully change my oil following what the manual says. But what about the Bible? Well, here things get a little complicated. A car manual is all about giving a clear, accurate description of the car. No stories, no poems, just the facts. The Bible, though, it's totally different. It's made up of all kinds of different writing, letters, history, poems, stories, prophecies, parables, all of which come together to reveal God's nature and his plan. So how does this difference affect how we understand the Bible as either true or untrue? Well, if you're a Christian, or at least are just familiar with how Christians typically read the Bible, you might be used to trying to read the Bible as a historical account, trying to figure out how creation began or how humanity came to be. But as we noticed from the examples earlier, trying to read the Bible from a purely historical perspective leads to issues. I mean, who ended up with the blood money? Was it Judas or was it the chief priests? And who ended up buying the field? Again, was it Judas or was it the chief priests? We could compare Genesis 1 and 2 here and ask similar questions. So if the Bible contradicts itself, does that mean it's totally untrue? Well, if our only conception of truth is that the thing either happened or it didn't, then because we're getting two different accounts about what happened to Judas, and only one can be true, then by extension, that means that at least in some way, the Bible is also untrue. But I think we should pause here for a moment. If we really think about how we talk about truth in our everyday experience, we don't always talk about truth in this way. It seems from our experience that we have other understandings of truth. We see this when we say things like, "You're a true friend," or the way that poem or movie spoke about life somehow felt true. A great example of this comes from one of my favorite books, The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho. In the book, a young shepherd boy named Santiago has a dream about a treasure at the pyramids. The next day, he meets a king who confirms that there actually is a treasure waiting for him at the pyramids, and tells Santiago to go find it. So, Santiago, trusting the king's advice, sells his sheep and sets off for the pyramids. After a long and difficult journey, Santiago finally makes it to his destination, to the pyramids, only to be robbed and beaten by bandits, and he's left with nothing. Through a series of events, however, Santiago figures out that the treasure he's been searching for this whole time is actually back where he started. And at the end of the story, he returns home and there he finds it. Now, important for this conversation, notice that the king told Santiago that there was a treasure at the pyramids, but that ended up not actually being the case. So if what the king said was wrong, does that mean that what he said was untrue? Well, in the same way that cookbooks or car manuals are true, yeah, what he said was false or untrue. However, if we look at the king's statements from the perspective of Santiago's whole journey, We can see that the king's statement that there was a treasure at the pyramids is true in another sense. You see, by the end of the story, Santiago is a changed man. Along his journey, he learned the ways of the desert, he found love, he grew in wisdom. Though he didn't find a literal treasure at the pyramids, Santiago realizes in the end that the real treasure was never the gold and jewels that he would eventually find when he returned home, but the treasure was actually the experiences of the journey itself. You see, if we look at the king's words with the end of the story in mind, we see that in a way he was right. There was a treasure at the pyramids. It just wasn't the treasure Santiago expected. See, this is a very different way of understanding truth than many of us are used to. For many of us, when we think of truth, we're really thinking of scientific truth. And we're used to asking questions like, did this really happen? Or can this thing be observed and verified? And we ultimately get into problems when we try to read the Bible looking for scientific truth. The truth of the Bible, and the way the Bible itself actually understands truth, is much closer to the type of truth we see in The Alchemist. Philosopher Samuel Fleischacker draws attention to this in the way the Hebrew word emet, often translated as truth, is used in the Old Testament. A few examples from scripture Fleischacker draws attention to include when Abraham's servant is trying to find a wife for Isaac. He tells Rebekah's father that God has led him on a true path and asks if they will deal with him in kindness and truth. We also see this when Moses' father-in-law tells Moses to find people of truth to help him judge the people. As you can see, this is pretty different than how we usually use the words truth or true in the modern world. Usually when we talk about something being true, we're talking about a claim or a statement, not people and paths as it's being used in the Old Testament. Here, as Fleischacker notes, emet could just as well be translated as trustworthy or reliable. The word emet and the notion of truth in these examples extends beyond an idea of truth that's only concerned with things that can be empirically verified. Rather, in these situations in Scripture, whether or not something is true has more to do with the character of the person or the nature of the path and one's experience with them. When Abraham's servant says that God led him on a true path, he's essentially saying that God led him down a path that was good or right. He's not saying that after testing the path against all other alternatives, and that through experimentation he's confirmed that this path is in fact the true one. He's saying that by trusting in God, God has ultimately led him to where he was meant to be. So what does all this mean for how we understand the Bible as true? When we talk about the Bible being true, what we're really getting at is that the Bible is trustworthy in its ability to lead us in a good direction. Now, this might be kind of confusing because we've just talked about how the Bible is full of inconsistencies. So how can a book that's full of inconsistencies be considered trustworthy or reliable in the first place? Well, you see, that's just the thing. Trustworthiness can't be evaluated in the same way scientific truth can. It can only be evaluated through experience and by offering trust to something even when I may not yet fully understand it. A great example of this is, say I'm considering developing a friendship with you. I have to offer you my trust before I fully know you. And it's only through experience with you, seeing how you're honest or dishonest, that I can ever come to know whether or not you're trustworthy or reliable. Now, it's obviously possible that you could break my trust. You could do something that's mean or dishonest or hateful that leads me to a point where I no longer deem you to be trustworthy or reliable. But either way, it still requires me to place my trust in you before I have all the facts on the table. We see the same thing in the case of Santiago and the king and the alchemist. Santiago could only come to know if what the king said was true by trusting him, by going on the journey, and by being transformed in his understanding of what the treasure actually is. There was no way to know with certainty whether or not the king's crazy claims were true without trusting beforehand and going on the journey. The Bible works similarly. Through its stories, letters, poems, and prophecies that are often confusing and even contradictory, we're led by the Spirit through reading, meditating on, discussing in community, and living out the text to the best of our ability to a new way of life in line with God's plan for the world. And it's only from this position of having already gone on the journey, if you will, that one can look back and see the Bible to be true and trustworthy. This is totally different than our typical scientific conception of truth. Usually for scientific truth, we want to have all of the facts on the table to then decide whether or not something is true. This isn't to say that Scripture's inconsistencies and contradictions just suddenly disappear. It's simply to say that they begin to not matter all that much. There's so much more I could talk about on this point, but for the sake of the length of this video, I just want to talk about two more really important points before closing. For the first point, Some of you might be thinking, okay, Andrew, so you're basically just saying that we need to blindly trust in the Bible and that somehow it will lead us down some good direction. What about all of the crazy religious fanatics out there who blindly trusted their religion and ended up hurting themselves and a lot of other people? Also, it seems like there are a lot of Christians out there who are pretty hateful, and they seem to put a lot of trust in the Bible. What about them? These are necessary and important questions. I mean, it's no secret that scripture has been used to justify some really horrendous ends. I mean, from decimating native populations in the Americas to justifying slavery, to justifying the killing of Jews and Muslims. Again, scripture has been used for a lot of really horrible stuff. So I just want you to know that I'm in no way condoning blind trust in a religion or in a religious authority or in some type of sacred book. I think it's important to understand, though, that these horrendous acts that we've seen Christianity and the Bible be a part of, where these things actually find their origin. It's entirely possible to read scripture through the lens of our own biases and preferences. And it's this type of reading, I think at least, that's the real danger of leading us down dark and dangerous paths. And I think this is where a community of faith becomes really important. You see, a community of faith can offer us a sort of sounding board to test out our ways of reading to see if we're in line with God's actual intention for the world. And if we're in a community that we can trust, or at least a community that's semi-healthy, I think we can avoid a lot of the really malevolent forms of religion that are out there. For the second point, I think it's helpful for modern readers to understand just how low of a priority providing historical or scientific accounts is for the Bible. A great example of this is the Gospels. To start, there are 4 of them, and each one narrates Jesus' life uniquely. And it seems if the Bible were really that concerned with historical accuracy and providing precise descriptions about the events that happened, that there wouldn't be 4 Gospels. I mean, my car doesn't have 4 manuals. It only has 1. Like if I had to compare and contrast 4 different manuals just to figure out how to change my oil, like I wouldn't be too happy. It's also helpful to realize here that the drive to read the Bible from a historical or scientific perspective is actually something that's not native to the Bible itself. As Fleischacker writes, for practically no one before the modern era is the truth of a sacred text supposed to be like the truths of modern empirical science. See, it's only within the past 500 years that these ways of reading and concerns about historical and scientific inaccuracies in the Bible have become such a major concern. For the Bible and the early church communities that read it, these seeming contradictions just weren't that big of a deal. And this is because for early readers of the Bible, their primary concern in reading the Bible was ultimately to encounter the living God within Scripture, to grow in wisdom and spiritual maturity through its variety of texts. Historical and scientific accuracy, though these things had their place, were ultimately a secondary concern for these early church communities. The truth of Scripture lay more in the manner of life Scripture invited its readers into than in its not so precise accounts of how things came to be. Now, there's so much more I could talk about on these points, but this video is getting a little bit long, so I'm going to end it here. If any of these points or topics were of interest to you, and if you have any other questions that you think would make great future videos, let me know. I would love to hear your suggestions in the comments below. My hope with these videos is to develop more conversation within the Christian tradition and with outside of it as well, and to also provide perspectives that maybe you've never encountered before. If you have any disagreements or critiques of anything that I've offered in this video, I'd love to hear them and to engage you in conversation. So please let me know. Thanks so much for watching.